Yes, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank, first of all, the audience. We're well into cocktail hour now, and y'all are hanging in there, so thank you. And I want to thank Michal and Tomasz because this is a fantastic conference. I'm going to just talk briefly, make 3 points about the geopolitics of enlargement and where I see enlargement today, and then talk a little bit about my current project on the Western Balkans and how some of the lessons that we've learned from the first enlargement are traveling to the Western Balkans. And I'm an optimist by nature and still an optimist after years of field research in the Western Balkans. So take that for what it's worth. I think the first point that is really important to make, Andy looked at the point of view of the EU as a whole and how enlargement impacts the EU as an international economic and foreign policy actor. I'm going to look at it from the point of view of the acceding states, right? And this is a point that's often lost when we think about enlargement in terms of its impact on EU institutions and on trust in the European Union and so forth. But from the point of view of the acceding states, joining the European Union is a fantastic change of geopolitical fortune. If you look at the history of these countries and how they have been treated over the last few hundreds years by their neighbors, by Moscow, by Berlin, by Rome, this is really a profound change of geopolitical fortune. And it's not just the protection of EU rules. It's not just having to abide by EU rules in all kinds of areas to do with the internal market and regulatory relations between states, but it's also about the geopolitical relationship between especially big and small states, or powerful and weak states, states such as Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic, Slovakia, even Poland. And I think Poland is a really nice example, since we have a Polish leitmotif to this conference, right? It's interesting to remember that in the summer of 1989, after the first non-communist prime minister, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, took power in Warsaw, he actually asked Gorbachev to keep Soviet troops in Poland until the agreement about Poland's border with Germany was finalized. And that just speaks to, not so long ago, the sense of sort of existential and historical uncertainty that existed between Warsaw and Berlin, or what was then Bonn. Then, of course, the Poles had to go through what seemed like a very long accession period, but in fact was quite short. And now they're in the European Union, and they certainly make their presence known when it comes to foreign policy, much more than and other EU parts of the EU policymaking process. Frank made this point already. It is actually stunning that, in a way, that there is no second-class membership on the table. Not even today, not even when we're talking about states like Serbia or Montenegro. There still really is just EU membership. Now, there are various opt-outs, transition periods. It's not clear that some new members want the euro. It's not clear the EU wants some states to take the euro. But by and large, it's still intact as full membership. And that is an incredibly important prize. And when I give talks in countries that are still in the accession process, feeling very miserable about having to take orders from Brussels, I like to remind them of this, that the prize is actually fantastic. And if you look at around, the position of small and weak states in other parts of the world and how they have to deal with their large neighbors, like the United States, this is a really good position to be in. The second point I'd like to make is a little bit of also of history of enlargement, which is that the initial goal of enlargement was it wasn't a civilizational project, and now we think of it as exporting democracy, and it has indeed become, I think, the most powerful kind of democracy promotion tool that an international actor has ever had. But initially, this was not what it was, right? It was really about securing the neighborhood. It was a geopolitical project to take countries that had already democratized and lock in that democratization, but also, more importantly, create a stable neighborhood for Germany and other countries. It was only in 1999 that the EU combined enlargement and as part of its foreign policy. Until 99, it was kept very separate. So it was only in 99, right, where the EU really said, look, we have this problem, the Western Balkans, and we are going to fix it using enlargement, at a time when Tudjman and Milosevic were still in power. And the third general point I want to make is one about our expectations about conditionality as a field. I know that all of you are aware of this, but I think it's worth repeating that our expectations about what conditionality can accomplish have just changed dramatically. And also our assessment of conditionality. I mean, when I was working on my book in the late 90s, when I started working on it, the charge was that the EU was being incredibly neo-imperialist, heavy-handed. How dare the EU ask these fledgling democracies to adopt 80,000 pages of acquis? This was destroying democracy, creating fake parliaments, and so on and so forth. And now we have a complete sea change, right? Where every conference I've been to for the last 3 years, the leitmotif is look at all the problems these countries went through the pre-accession process, and yet look at everything that's wrong with them. And I think it's just important for us to be kind of clear about the fact that our expectations about what enlargement and the pre-accession process could accomplish, there have been a lot of shifting goalposts, let's put it that way. And I think that what we really need to do, which is what we are doing, is look at the variation in existing outcomes in terms of domestic politics, right? The EU treated these countries more or less the same, and we have a lot of variation, and most of that variation comes down to domestic politics. And the irony here, and this speaks really nicely to Anna's paper and also our colleague Abby Innes's paper recently at a different conference, that the countries where the EU mattered most, where EU conditionality mattered most, are the countries with the most difficult initial conditions when it comes to democratization. Those are the countries where you have state capture, right? Bulgaria, Romania, even Slovakia and the Czech Republic. I mean, these are playgrounds for rent-seeking elites. I know Prague is beautiful, but 20% of all public funds are stolen. Slovakia and the Czech Republic, if you look at rule of law, it's atrocious, right? The Czechs and the Slovaks are closer to Romania than they are to Poland. Sorry, guys, in some ways. So, after the Mečiar government fell, not a single oligarch, not a single politician went to jail, even though there was a massive privatization theft that went on. So the problem is that the countries where you have state capture are the countries where the EU, in a way, did the most hard work, but they're also the countries with this problem that is so difficult for the EU pre-accession process to dislodge, and that's state capture by rent-seeking elites. But I like to kind of call for the counterfactual, right? Whenever you're feeling skeptical about conditionality, think of the counterfactual. What would these countries look like absent the EU pre-accession process? And think about things like, I love it when I was in the Prague metro and there were posters everywhere saying, you have the right not to be discriminated at work because of your sexual orientation or your gender or your religion. This kind of changing of the national discourse, or even introducing questions like human rights or women's rights into the public discussion, I think are incredibly important. And our colleague Connor Dwyer has been doing a really interesting project about LGBT groups and how it's actually the backlash against EU conditionality that then creates the cooperation among pro-rights groups that manages to really change the way society treats the LGBT community. Okay, now going on to the Balkans quickly. Essentially, when I look at the Western Balkans and the EU's enlargement process, I see so much continuity and not so much difference. And I actually see a lot of similarities in terms of political transition in Belgrade and Prague and in Skopje and Sofia. So I don't think that we're talking about two different things at all. And this is actually a controversial statement in some rooms, probably not in this one. In terms of the old member states, the current member states, the terms of enlargement have changed in the sense that for the first enlargement you had geopolitical benefits and you also had economic benefits. In the Western Balkan states, these are such small economies. So to speak of some kind of an economic benefit for the EU from enlarging to the Western Balkans is really a stretch. But that does have a silver lining because it means that the economic adjustment to accepting these countries, as long as they're not hotbeds for organized crime, are going to be quite small. And the game is really about political stability. It's about, I've done quite a few interviews now, it's really about seeing this as a region that if we don't integrate into the EU is going to cause us problems down the line. And, fair enough, right? This is a region where we're going to have uncontrolled immigration and potentially state breakdown and even renewed ethnic conflict. So it's a matter of national interest from the point of securing the neighborhood. From the point of the Western Balkan candidate states, it's also the same basic equation, right? If you look at the Serbian government or the Montenegrin government, which are now bending over backwards to do everything they can to move forward, the costs of exclusion have become very high, and therefore they're willing to move mountains, so to speak, to move forward. And here I think it's important to remember it's not just economic benefits, it's also protection of EU rules. And the case of Macedonia, which I've already mentioned once today, is a really shocking case, right? It just goes to show you the geopolitical importance of being on the inside and not the outside. Here we have a tiny state which has been held hostage by Greece, even though Greece has had such a spectacular breakdown, right? I mean, you would think that Greece at this point, if at any moment the other EU member states could pressure Greece to just let Macedonia go, you would think now would be the moment, and yet it still has not happened. And if you go to Skopje today, you will see the terrible results of that. So the same basic equation, economic benefits, protection of EU rules, and being on the inside, of course, not just in terms of trade, but also immigration, education, and know-how. The impact on domestic politics, it's also similar mechanisms, a lot of focal point for like-minded elites, strengthening the hand of reformist elites at the expense of others, and this adapting of political party agendas. And here I will just talk a little bit about what has worked. There has really been a sea change in the Western Balkans in the last few years. Montenegro is moving forward, Croatia's joined, but Serbia, which was the last country in Europe where you sort of had these nail-biting elections, right? What was going to happen? Were we going to get anti-EU, pro-Moscow, extreme nationalists in power? In 2008, the largest party in the Serbian parliament was an extreme nationalist, anti-EU party. And we go from there to 2012, when that party has split and transformed itself. The split was because of the EU. There's no other reason for it. This is how it was, everybody consistently says that this party split because on the EU issue, and that party has now been elected, and it is now regulating relations with Kosovo. So it's the party of Šešelj that split. So Šešelj's in The Hague. He's a hate monger, a warmonger, but most of his party is now strikingly pro-EU. And this is impressive, right? I mean, it is an incredible sea change in a country that very recently was considered very unstable. Now the problem countries which have already been mentioned, Bosnia and Macedonia, they each have a combination of three things that, how much time do I have?
You're good.
I'm good. Okay, I don't want to go
See
over.
the number of pages lying here.
Yeah, I'm on my last page. Bosnia and Macedonia each have, there's three areas where the EU runs into trouble. The first is expertise, and here especially in the rule of law. If you look at what the EU was trying to do in terms of bolstering the rule of law in the 2004 and even the 2007 accession countries, you see that they really had no idea how to bolster the rule of law. This wasn't a priority. This wasn't something that the EU has acquis on. And it wasn't something that the member states particularly thought the EU should be doing. And even though some of their voices coming from the accession countries saying we have real problems with the rule of law, it really wasn't a focus. And it was only after Bulgaria and Romania joined and it became clear how poorly they had done. And if you actually look at Bulgaria and Romania, they make almost no progress on the rule of law between 2000 and 2010. So it's not like the accession period is transformative when it comes to the rule of law. And so that is a real problem for the EU in terms of expertise. Another problem is consistency or meritocracy. Right? And here, of course, with Greece, the whole idea of any kind of consistency or meritocracy is obliterated for Macedonia, but you've also had a lot of problems in Bosnia with inconsistent conditionality. The EU just doesn't know what to do with Bosnia. I go to the State Department once a year, and I get about 10 questions. Why hasn't the EU fixed Bosnia? And at about question 5, I get irritated, and I said, well, the EU didn't create Bosnia. These crazy institutions were your idea. I'm not saying they were bad. At the moment, they might have seemed like a good idea, but they've completely blocked the transmission of citizen preferences to political parties. And then their last problem that the EU has is legitimacy. When it comes to issues of sovereignty and territory conditionality is just much more difficult to implement. And from the Baltic states, it was tough, right? It was tough to get Estonia to change its citizenship policies. It was tough to get the Czechs to change their citizenship policies. So the EU runs into problems. But of course, its greatest success now is the regulation of relations between Serbia and Kosovo. There's still a ways to go in terms of the implementation of that, and things could still go wrong. But if there's one amazing thing that has happened in the Western Balkans over the last, say, 4 years that you don't know about, it's the transformation of the Serbian electorate. I made this joke about the Slovaks being the Serbian diaspora, but there's something to it. I mean, the Serbian voter doesn't care about Kosovo anymore. Now, we've learned from Orban that they might learn to care later if they get the right guy in charge. But right now, the shift away from towards the EU and away from seeing Kosovo as a stumbling block is really quite transformative. So even though I fully expect that some of the problems that we've talked about in terms of backsliding after accession, all of these things will hold true. But one of the things which is so striking is how even in these Western Balkan states you see political party systems coalescing around the goal of joining the European Union. And I think if you run the counterfactual, you can only conclude that this really is a pretty amazing tool of democracy promotion for all of its faults.